Okay, good evening YouTubers. So this video that I'm doing here is just sort of a brief introduction, maybe not so brief, maybe a medium, depends on how I feel, but what is a Unix-like system? And how does that compare to something like Windows or OS X or some other operating system that you're familiar with? I'm not going to deep dive on the technical side of it too much, but we can talk about the philosophical and superficial technical differences between these things. So, what is Linux? What is it? Well, maybe we should go back and talk about what is a Unix-like system. A Unix-like system is I guess you could say, a general purpose, fully multi-user system. And what do I mean by that? I mean that a Unix-like system can be used for almost any purpose that a service has been written for and it is basically able to allow multiple users to access those services at the same time. Now, for those people who've studied computer science, we know that the at the same time bit is pretty much illusory, and that there is in the CPU a time sharing relationship that is unavoidable. But in saying that, that basically is the essence of a Unix-like system, is that it's multi-user and it's general purpose. Now, you might tailor your particular Unix-like system that you have installed for a particular purpose, but in the end, a Unix-like system is pretty much there for the purpose of providing general services and to multiple users. How does that contrast with, say, Windows? Well, Windows today is pretty much a multi-user system, but it wasn't always the case. With Windows, you can have multiple people logging into it at the same time today, either locally or remotely, from the best part that I understand there. You can have multiple services running, so technically speaking, as far as the use cases are concerned, Windows is quite similar in that it's a general use operating system that can provide multiple services depending on what those services are, and it can do so to multiple users. So, where do they differ? I guess one thing is that Windows is always a graphical user environment. Now, sure, you can have a shell that you can use, log into, that sort of thing, but in the end you still always have a frame buffer. You still always have to, I guess, log in some GUI way. Whereas this contrasts against Unix-like systems. Unix-like systems, you don't have to have a graphical user environment running at the time. In fact, a lot of those web servers and things like that are very much doubt that they have a graphical user interface running. They're expecting a experienced, seasoned system administrator, Unix-like system administrator, log in, do what they need to do and log out. Simple as that. Or do the system monitoring that they need to do, either locally or remotely, and then log out. No GUI involved. Some of these systems like Red Hat have a graphical user interface, such as GNU, that run on top of Xorg, but in a lot of these cases they're not going to even bother running Xorg, and in fact they may do so, they may not run Xorg because of security reasons and things like that. They would reduce the footprint, the number of services that are running on that system. So what about the philosophical differences? Well, I think we should maybe deviate back onto the track of the technical side and talk about what's the difference between OS X, for example, and Linux, or GNU plus Linux. OS X is based on open source components with some proprietary components such as the Quartz compositor and things like that that sit on top of that open source or free software layer. The thing is that the entire shrink-wrapped thing is proprietary. That is basically, at its core, the difference. You're not going to access the source code to Quartz unless you have some sort of non-disclosure agreement or something like that. Some reason why Apple would let you borrow it. I guess it comes down to philosophy. And also you've got to remember that OS X actually is a Unix-like system. It's actually not too dissimilar from FreeBSD, of which many of its components it takes from. And Apple is not that dissimilar. Apple's OS X is not that dissimilar. It does use a different kernel called the GNU kernel, but probably won't go into the details of what that is all about. But we can say that from my perspective anyway, that the Unix-like systems are renowned for being robust, reliable, stable, very little downtime, and security problems tend to be null and void. Now, that's not entirely true. You can make a Unix-like system insecure, or it can be set up by default insecure. Mac OS X, some people say, is insecure. I'm not a security expert, so I'm not going to comment on that. But the point is that Unix-like systems are notorious, famous, I guess you could say, for being very secure and very reliable, stable, etc. Windows. Windows actually has a great history for being compatible with different hardware, compatible with different software. There's almost not a piece of software out there, a software title, that's gained significance that doesn't run on Windows. Windows is extremely popular on the desktop and has still a significant foothold in the server market. Although that's debatable for things like web servers, generic web servers and things like that. But the point is that Windows is still exceedingly popular, at least on the desktop. In an emerging market such as, well, it's no longer really emerging, but the tablet or the portable environment, they're not doing so well there, which is fine because they still have profitable market in the business computing realm. So that leads me to another point. What is the fundamental difference between a system like FreeBSD, GNU/Linux, and Windows? It's about freedom. You see, most users probably won't care about it, but GNU/Linux, GNU plus Linux, FreeBSD, they are free software operating systems. Not all the components in there are free and open source, but rather some of them, such as hardware, firmware, are actually proprietary, unfortunately. There are some examples of computers out there that do not require the use of proprietary firmware, such as the Yearlong. Richard Stallman happens to be the president of the Free Software Foundation, and he has a Yearlong computer. It's like a little netbook or laptop, and yeah. But FreeBSD also includes some firmware. By default, the Linux kernel includes some firmware, which makes it much easier to run the appropriate drivers for a particular piece of hardware. So, an example of a piece of hardware that I have, I'm currently using this desktop that you see here. It's currently using the Radeon SI driver, Southern Islands driver, and that is an open source free software driver. And however, it relies on some proprietary firmware. Now I can show you that some other time, but we don't need to get into that. We just need to know that in order for my graphics card to start properly, it requires some firmware. Otherwise you get no Xorg. It'll just screw up. So, the fundamental difference is that you are, with a free and open source piece of software, you are free to study the code. And of course, in order to study a program or study the code properly, the code has to be available. Secondly, you can distribute copies of the code, of the original code. Thirdly, you can modify the code, right? Fourthly, you can share those copies that you've made and modified. And I suppose in that, amongst the mix, if I go to the Free Software website, or Free Software Foundation website, and we'll take a look at that right now. Just give that a second to load up, and we'll go to the Free Software Foundation. Right. So, what have we got here? Free Software Foundation. So what I might do, oh, here we go. That's Free Software Foundation Europe, sff.org. Right. Now these guys, I'm not going to sit there and advertise everything they're doing there, but they basically write a significant part of the user land, you can say. That's the software that you type into or whatever. And what they do is they advocate for fundamental freedoms. And I don't think they're giving us the freedoms here. But what we can do is we can take a look at that. Let's have a look. Let's type in freedom. Freedom, here we go. Maybe that's it. Let's have a look. The free software philosophy. Oh, free software definition, that's what we want, yes. Okay, so that didn't work. Let's take it back and go to the free software definition. This is something you might want to take a look at. So the freedom to run the software for any purpose, freedom to study other programs and change it, so you'll need access to the source code, freedom to distribute copies so you can help your neighbour, freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions, basically improved versions or just changes. That is what free software is. Now I could also go and look for the open source definition. You've probably heard me talk about free software and open source software. Now look, they're not the same, but you can take them as loose synonyms for the purpose of this screencast. Anyway, we look at the open source definition. If you type that into Google, you can go and have a look at the open source definition, and here you go, the open source definition. Now you can have a read through that. Some things are similar, other things are a bit different, but basically they do tie in reasonably well together. But we won't talk about too much of the differences. But anyway, essentially with a Linux based operating system such as GNU plus Linux, you can study the code, you can modify the code, and you are in fact obligated, if you distribute modifications, to supply the source code for your modifications and the original. That way someone can compile that program, study that component and that program and run it. So why do I use GNU plus Linux? I actually use FreeBSD from time to time in a virtual machine. I use GNU plus Linux because I find, for my purposes, it's better. It's simply better. I'll tell you why. I've got access to Firefox, which is the web browser I prefer to use. I actually have access to Google Chrome if I want to, as well. I have access to Steam, which is the Steam client for gaming, although I don't use my current install of GNU plus Linux for gaming. I have access to VLC. I have access to programs that will allow me to connect to the MSN Live network, to the Google Chat network, to the Steam network, to the Facebook network. I have access to codecs, which will allow me to look at videos. I have codecs that will allow me to listen to music. I have control over my computing. And that's really what it is at its core. I am not a software developer. I have developed one program, which you can take a look at sometime. I'll mention it another time. It's on my previous channel, Ubiquitous 1980. That's not really a previous channel, but one that I haven't ported all the old stuff over from yet, if I choose to do so. But I have choice. I can run the programs that I want. I know that if there's a problem in the software, other people will fix it. A recent case was there's a vulnerability in GNU TLS. A whole bunch of distros had patches for this particular bug. Within 5 hours, 7 hours of the bug becoming public knowledge. That's very fast. I have the same ability to look at Flash if I really want to, although Flash is proprietary. There is a replacement called GNU, and you can try that. I have access to quality software such as LibreOffice. Okay. There's also other programs, statistical programs, if I want to use them, like the R programming language and suite. I have access to a Photoshop clone, well, not a clone, but functional clone, called GIMP. I can meet 90, maybe 95% of my use cases with GNU plus Linux. Now, what can you do with it? Well, for starters, you can have a desktop that starts for you, and this is without a solid state drive, very, very quickly. I mean, there are people out there running, mine's not particularly fast to boot, but you can boot up in about 15 or 20 seconds, which is very, very quick. There are higher speeds you can get with solid state drives and things like that. I had SteamOS installed the other day on my solid state drive, and it was booting lovely, probably 10 seconds, maybe 8 seconds. Now, they're fast operating systems. They don't use a lot of resources. I'll give you the case in point. Let's have a look. Alt-D, H-top. It'll let me, no it won't, so I'll have to do console, and we'll do H-top. Okay. I'm using on a 64-bit system less than 900 meg running Firefox. It would be much less if I had just booted into the system, but just remember, I'm also recording this video on the same system. It's a very low memory usage. Very little resource usage too. Notice that there's not really a lot going on here. That's even though I'm having to manipulate a codec for video capture. So the resource usage is lower. There's less requirement for antivirus, anti-malware software. I'm not going to say there's no requirement. That's your personal choice. I prefer to simply be prudent about the websites that I go to and the emails that I respond to and access and all that sort of thing. I think security starts somewhere between the chair and the computer. Security is a process, not a product, I guess you could say. I've heard it said before. So, less overhead, faster in general operating system. This is why there's big supercomputers out there. 500 top supercomputers, most of them are using a Unix-like system derivative, specifically some sort of GNU plus Linux distribution. The other thing too is that it can be built to your specification. I'm using Gen 2 at the moment, which is very, very, very configurable. And there are distributions out there that are even more configurable. Not even distributions, I guess at that level they're meta distributions, or the book, like Linux from scratch. You can go look up Linux from scratch online. I think we can go fishing back to here and take a look at Linux from scratch. Not I wouldn't recommend it for the beginner, but you can see here Linux from scratch, and you can find out all about Linux from scratch. Look, for the beginning user, I'd probably recommend Linux Mint. Right, Linux Mint, very straightforward, minimal intrusion on privacy, straightforward, fast operating system, should be pretty easy to install on a UEFI or BIOS-based system. So there you go, you can go to linuxmint.com and have a bit of a squiz around there. They've got different different releases. They've got the Linux Mint Debian edition, which is a rolling release. But you probably want to install Linux Mint 16 Cinnamon, Linux Mint 16 Mate if you've got a lower end computer, or you just prefer simplicity, or indeed Linux Mint 16 KDE. So the major desktops are well and truly represented there. There are other distributions as well, such as Debian. You heard me mention Debian before. Right, you can go to Debian, go and have a look at their website. It won't be as bling bling, but it's still a very decent operating system. And I suggest you go and have a look at the Debian website. And if you're a bit more of an advanced, perhaps you're a computer science student or graduate, straight off the bat, probably look at Debian. Just remember too that Linux Mint is not that different from Debian. It's just a bit more user friendly on the desktop. The internal guts of it is pretty much the same. It uses the same package manager, uses the same init system, from the best of my knowledge. Well, maybe it uses Upstart, not sure, depends on the circumstance. Maybe Linux Mint Debian Edition uses the same. Not the point. Anyway, the point is that you've got choice. You want to use Slackware. You can actually another one that you might want to look at is OpenSUSE. OpenSUSE, my Linux colleague and friend Caddy, or Linux for You and Me, he recently did a look at OpenSUSE. So that's another good look. So the world's your choice. I mean, if you don't want to have to customize the distribution, but you just want to have a look around, you've got these. Of course, you've got my favorite, which is Gentoo. Okay, so Gentoo Linux, which is GNU plus Linux distribution. Look, again, not much bling bling here, but this is really a bling bling operating system. I tell you, you want to build an operating system from scratch, well, pretty much from scratch. Here's the way to do it, along with LFS, as I mentioned earlier. I suppose I should mention Ubuntu as well. I mean, there are enough Ubuntu videos online, but Ubuntu is not just one operating system, but a whole bunch of operating systems that are built around the Ubuntu core, specifically the most popular one being, well, arguably most popular being the this version here, which is the desktop. We can have a look at the desktop, and you can have a bit of a look at that yourself. The only thing about it is that some people disagree with Ubuntu's search policy, which gets provided anonymized data to companies such as Amazon. So, well, previously did, probably currently still does. I don't use Ubuntu personally. I do use a derivative of Ubuntu on my home theatre system. So, called XBMC. There's another one you can look at. You can look at XBMC Ubuntu. So XBMC Ubuntu. XBMC Ubuntu. So you can have a look at that as well if you want to create a home theatre PC. You can do that as well. You probably look at some reviews on YouTube or something like that and find out more about it. But what I'm trying to get at is that GNU plus Linux, or any free and open source operating system, is really subject to your own will and capability. If you have the will and the skill, or even just the will, I guess you could say, you can change it to do what you want it to do. You'll develop the skill by applying the will. You can get it to do whatever you want. There are other notable mentions, such as the Fedora project. Fedora again, Fedora project's great. It focuses on free and open source software. You see? So this is, free your desktop with Fedora. So you can use that as well. So there's any number of choices. I should probably mention DistroWatch. DistroWatch is a fantastic website. It's a commercial website. It's not an organisation, so to speak. It's or a non-government organisation. It's a commercial commercial website, you can see that various distributions at their various release points are advertised here. So for example, LFS, it just had a 7.5 release. You can go and have a look at this. Sometimes they advertise on books you might want to have a look at. So what have they got here? Privacy, yeah, I mean, probably not the best example. They've had a lot of GNU plus Linux, you know, stuff going on here. Raspberry Pi, VirtualBox, look, any number of things. So the world's your oyster. Now I'm not saying that you absolutely must use a free and open source operating system. But the fact of the matter is, because the code is open, it's not as easy to slip malicious features into a piece of open source or free software. It just get forked out or removed or whatever if that happened. So basically this sort of comes down to probably 3 key points. Is it's free for you to use for whatever purpose you want. You can configure it the way you want as long as you've got the skill and the will to do it, and you can share your contributions to the world. Whether they choose to use them or not, it's their choice, but you can share. And that's what I really like about it. I think that other operating systems kind of miss the point. You can't take, for example, Direct3D from Windows, again, without an NDA, or DirectX, as some of you might know it, but that's got more to do with inputs than just graphics, but and audio. But you can't just do that. Whereas under GNU plus Linux, our 3D stack called Mesa, you can grab that, hack that, and do what you want to it. If you've got the skill, the knowledge, the ability, you can do that. And that's what this operating system is all about, and that is what free software is all about, and even FreeBSD is all about. I mean, FreeBSD has less hardware support in some circumstances than GNU plus Linux, but that's what these are there for. And they're there for you to learn about them. Now, where can you learn about them? YouTube is a great resource for you guys to learn about them. Sorry it took a while to get into this video as well. I mean, you know, I just wanted to, you know, introduce the topic slowly, and for those people who are not kind of used to it, as you can tell, I'm a bit of a chess fan. But anyway, let's Linux for You and Me is very good. You can go to Linux for You and Me's channel, take a look at his stuff, okay? And he does a lot of Linux reviews and a few tutorials here on GNU plus Linux stuff. You can also, Das Gregor, right? You can have a look at Das Gregor, very, very knowledgeable, been using GNU plus Linux for about 12 or 13 years, okay? And I should mention that GNU plus Linux has been around since about 91, 92, when Linus Torvalds wrote the first kernel version back around then. And for some more mainstream kind of nice sort of videos that are a bit, as I say, more mainstream, probably less technically focused, you can look at Nixie Pixel. Okay, Nixie Pixel is well educated on
Hey, I'm Nixie.
we won't play that, okay, but you can look at that. That's, you know, another great channel to look at. So you can look at Linux from scratch, it'll teach you a lot. There's also Linux forums, you know, Linux forums, you know, you can go there, or Linux questions, you can go there, you know, let's have a look at that. You can go in here and ask your question and get an answer. You can go on IRC, so let's go on IRC, okay, so you can go on IRC and, well, just ask a question in there. That'll come up in a minute, it won't take too long. When the channels open up down here, you'll be able to see those channels come up, yep, and then you can go and ask your question in here, you know. World's your oyster. So I recommend you have a go at it. I don't think you should be convinced to use it. but I think you should have a go at it if you want low incidence of viruses or malware, high uptime, great configurability, great ability to contribute and share and receive the benefits of sharing through a community. You will never ever come across a community quite like the free and open source / Unix-like system community. It really is full of interesting characters, people who will shoot you down, people who will support you. I guess it's just like real life. Anyway, I think we should stop it there. I've had a great time presenting this video. Please give me your comments. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, maybe throw a comment on Linux View on Me's channel or Daz Gregor. I know both of them from online. One of them I know personally, the other I know from online. You know, share. Go out there, have a try, share your experience, put it in the comment section, but just give it a go and see how you go with it. Anyway, this is Nix User signing out, and we'll have another video up in the next week or so. Catch you later. Bye, YouTubers.